And I think we're farsighted enough that we can continue to do this, and I think that's right with our system. Peer review, critical self-analysis is being accomplished. I'd like to have you list the professions that do serious peer review, other than the medical profession, which has gone a long ways down the road. Still has a long ways to go, but it's doing it. I don't see that being done in a heck of a lot of other areas. It needs to be done. I think that's right about the system, peer review and self-critical analysis. Okay, now what's wrong with it? Under the present system, there exists little or really no incentive for the patient to be selected by his care. Why? 90% or more is paid by some third party, so he doesn't put a price tag with a value or a service. They're two different things. That's wrong. Another thing I think is wrong is the non-existence of a national health policy. We've talked about it. We've talked about a national health policy, but we don't have one. What has it resulted in? It's resulted in regulation by state, by the federal, and by the local. Regulation, which has resulted in duplication. It's resulted in contradictory policies and procedures. So much so that there are people who estimate that 25% of our health care dollar is necessitated or paid out because of these regulations, duplications, the situations that are caused by this. And these are stifling situations. They stifle initiative, they stifle creativity, and the reaction finally gets to be reactionary, defensive, and that's wrong when we have to go and defend our system instead of talk the good about it. I think it's wrong if the political and the bureaucrat do not reflect the public's desire, or that they do not recognize that no one system will work, and that they create a single system which they hope will be universal. As they say, national health care or universal health care is now the new term to get rid of this national health care term. And what has happened because of this political and bureaucratic approach, we have piecemeal legislation and laws which require that we're talking about budgetary medicine, which may lead to rationing of health care. And I don't want to be involved in the rationing of health care. It's wrong when the politic, the bureaucrat, and the American public do not want to recognize what priorities are. One last thing, health education for the population. We've talked about it for years. We're not doing it. We haven't even scratched the surface. What we need to do is focus on health education being part of our basic school system. We ought to teach health just like we teach reading, writing, and arithmetic. These children are going to use those things all their lives, and they're going to use their body and their health all their lives. I think it's too late for somebody my age to change and adapt. You know, I like to have a little drink now and then, and I like to eat a little too much, and all the things that are bad. It's probably too late for me to change my lifestyle, but it's not too late to change the lifestyle of the children, and they're the future. We have to start teaching in our school systems health care and what it means and how to do it and how to go about it, probably in kindergarten and all the way through. That's a problem. How are we going to fund this? How is it going to be done? How are we going to get school boards to accept that? It's wrong if we don't try to do the job that way. It's wrong when the healthcare professional doesn't get involved in health education. To summarize, I guess in one, it's wrong. I'd like to say this. I think it's wrong when there are those who need help. In fact, I know it's wrong when there are those that need help. But because of regulation, because of laws, because of inflexibility of those who are responsible, that there are those that do not receive the care and treatment they need. Thank you.
Thank you. I think we've had a lot of different issues on this problem that have been brought up today. Before, however, we pursue these and before we allow some rebuttal and questions, I think it would be a good idea if we could take a little break now. Why don't we all try to get ourselves back here, say in 10 minutes, and then we can resume discussion of this. Okay, now that we've had a nice break, we'd like to return to our topic, and we'd first like to give each of the panel members a chance, if they wish, to rebut anything that others brought up or make any additional comments that they would like to at this point. First, Dr. McGraw, do you have anything to add?
Well, yes, I'd like to be sure I'm understood. I don't think that, I think we've got a good set of arrangements, but far from perfect. I don't think our system is sufficiently systematized or aware of itself as a system, nor do I think that the system understands fundamentally what it is addressing. When Mr. Ross spoke, he was speaking from the standpoint of the whole system, the region. The system, of course, has two elements. It has a provider and a consumer element, and those things have to be reconciled. To come back to my drawing over here, we used to have a very simple system, one doctor and one patient. And now it's infinitely more complex, and we have an arrangement where there really is no such thing as a fully independent medical practitioner anymore. There's not even such a thing as a fully independent community hospital. The hospitals are, by the very nature of the economic arrangements, the complexity of the technology, the scarcity of resources, linked in a network, linked in a syncytium. And I'm sure that Mr. Ross could tell us about the kind of lack of understanding about that characterizes hospital administrators, board members, communities, and medical staffs. We are, and this, I don't mean this to come across as a sharp and carping criticism, but I'm just, again, saying it like it is. We are doing what Marshall McLuhan described as walking backward into the future. That is to say, we're looking at how things were and kind of acting on that premise. Now, I put the organization of this system in terms of the hospitals relating to one another, but that's just as true about the medical staff in its relation to the hospital and vice versa. Do these have a sense of common purpose, and are they addressing a community as a whole? Do they think about what the community needs? Let me give you an example, and I don't mean to sharply contradict what Dr. Swanson said, but you know, it's not universally true that when somebody gets to an emergency room, they get in the system. They will get in the system under these circumstances. If they have a real full-blown, all-out illness, if they've got a broken leg, they'll get brought into the hospital. And they will get a doctor and they'll move on from there. If it's something less, you know, there is a phenomenon called easy disengagement where they kind of get sort of brushed off. And it makes a great deal of difference whether the medical staff of the hospital and the hospital say to themselves collectively, look, we got a problem, let's solve it. Or whether the medical staff in effect says, you know, we got all we can do with what we got, you solve it. Under that latter circumstance, and I wasn't suggesting that was true at all in Mason City, Dr. Swanson and I discussed it, but it's true many places. Under the latter circumstance, then people getting into the emergency room are, you know, they've got one toe in the system, but they're not fully in. You cannot have any real certainty that they will be. So my concern about how we're depicting this is that we have indeed made monumental progress. I take great pride. Very, very few times do professions who've got everything going for them, or sectors of society, really reform and restructure themselves. I think we've done it under a lot of pressure. We are doing it. And I would contrast what's going on in the health sector with what's going on, say, in the justice sector of our society. I frankly think there's very little comparison, but, you know, I might be prejudiced. But nonetheless, I think that we have not recognized the dimensions of the adaptation which must be made. And I think it partly comes back to our training. And I'm a medical educator, and I want to say this. When I went through medical school, I and my contemporaries emerged with a sense of being independent practitioners. God knows it was difficult, and we came out of that experience feeling as though we'd done it all ourselves, and much disposed to this one-to-one mode of operation, and doing it very well, but having very little understanding of the new complexities that were coming into the system, that indeed we really did need to get Humpty Dumpty back together to conduct our work in that way. And we saw it as an entirely optional thing, whether we went in solo practice or functioned in a self-consciously integrated way with other doctors, just as we saw it as an entirely optional thing, whether we saw ourselves as a member of a hospital staff or not. In my time, years and years ago when we were doing this, we were oftentimes members of several hospital staffs, if we were in a city, and we kind of played one off against another. Now, the fact of the matter is that times have changed, and the range is being fenced. The buffalo are gone, and we're part of a much more organized set of arrangements, and we haven't done our business that way. I hope this doesn't come across as some kind of a, thumbs down on medicine. I don't feel that way. We have adaptations to make. And I think that what I've just said about physicians is true in spades also of hospitals. American community hospitals were the glory of our system of services in the last generation. As individual, independent organisms, they were highly competitive. They remain that way. And that is what we need. We need a greater awareness that the hospitals of Iowa, for instance, are indeed a network without a totally independent and competitive mode of operating, serving the public in the best way.
Okay, fine. Mr. Ross.
I have no rebuttal to make of any of our three speakers. However, I have a couple of addendums that I would like to add. And I think the first of these deals with the emergency room physician. I won't go on too deeply into that, but the system must provide continuity of care. And in our urban areas, which I am well acquainted with from prior experiences, in our urban areas particularly, when we as a system become increasingly reliant upon that spot care that's received at the emergency room, something tends to happen to this concept of health that Mr. Linden talked about. I think it's partly this concept of crash care, episodic care, point care, any terminology that you want to put on it, that leads towards a general impression that we as individuals totally disregard our bodies. We abuse ourselves because these physicians can make us well. These hospitals can make us well. And there's always that point of contact, and when my body fails, or when I'm in an accident, there is always that point of contact that I can reach. And I think this thing really stifles our own ability to look out for our own health. I'd like to say something else too, and that's regarding what Chuck said about health education and our lifestyles. I guess we all get hung up on lifestyles from time to time. How much of the medicine that these honorable physicians deliver to us that we could deliver ourselves have we forgotten? Iowa, as a frontier state, I'm sure, with its hardy pioneer stock, cured many of the ills that today's society carry to the physician's office or to the hospital emergency room. Not only are we ignorant about accessing the system, we're not teaching our young, and we haven't been for many years because I don't know, those things that are pre-symptomatic that we can do for ourselves before we need the physician's care. It works a tremendous burden on pediatricians to see all the snotty noses in town, if you will. And I think most pediatricians will agree that it works a tremendous burden upon themselves. So let's not only talk about accessing the system, let's not talk only about education of efficient and effective use of the system. Let's talk, and let's not talk about, you know, the symptomatic thing that when we have a cardiac arrest because, you know, we pass out and that's gone in an instant. Let's really educate our young people in the era of the future about self-care as well as self-health lifestyle. And I think that's my addendum to Chuck's comments.
Thank you. Dr. Sorensen.
Well, I'd like to comment on this education business a little bit too. It sounds great, and it is great, Mr. Ross, but it's a whole lot easier said than done. And if you spent as much time trying to do what you're talking about as I have, you get pretty frustrated. There are lots of experiments on record in which the doctor goes into the patient, giving instructions as to what to do when he goes home. Sometimes you take a tape recording of it, you know, so you can play back and hear everything that's been said. Then you wait 15 minutes, and then have another doctor go in and say, did he tell you anything about what to do when you get home? Well, no, he didn't tell me a thing. So, it's not easy. There's an article in the same paper this morning that you, I believe it's today's paper, of a lady, PhD in nutrition at Johns Hopkins, I think, who was telling us that we ought not to just ignore fat people when they come in the office. We ought to motivate them to reduce in some way. Well, that's a whole lot easier said than done, too. And sometimes it's impossible. So all of these things make this business of education of the public very difficult. I recall one patient that I had in Mason City some years ago who weighed 285 pounds. I don't think there'd be any argument that she was overweight. But when I put her on a reduction diet and convinced her that this is what she should do, she became psychotic. Well, which is worse, to have a psychotic patient on your hand or somebody who's just fat? Well, I gave up. I said, just
Probably a fat psychotic patient.
no, she's still functioning, she still has a job, and I never yet since have ever said a word about her reducing because I don't want to deal with the psychosis involved, and she doesn't want to have it either. Now, maybe she snowed me, I don't know, but at least enough so that she was completely inoperative. She couldn't work, she couldn't hold her job, she couldn't handle her family, she couldn't do a thing. And I've never forgotten it. So these are some of the things that are involved in patient education that makes it a very difficult affair. I don't know how many people quit smoking because of all the advertisements about here. I suspect, I think the market for cigarettes has gone up, hasn't it, during all this instead of lower. Certainly the market for alcohol has gone up. So it isn't all simple. Another comment that I would like to make in reply to some of the complexity that Dr. McGraw mentioned, you brought up the subject that full payment by third-party payers has aggravated the problem. I don't think there's any question about that in the minds of hospital administrators, and certainly physicians and certainly Blue Cross executives. I still remember the experience of the Michigan Blue Shield in 1949 when they announced that they would pay for one chest x-ray for each Blue Shield subscriber per year. But there was no educational campaign with it about don't have an x-ray unless you need it. Nor did they take the doctors into the thing ahead of time and say don't order this x-ray unless there's a reason for it. Well, what happened? Every Blue Shield subscriber in the state of Michigan went to his doctor and said, I'm entitled to a chest x-ray and by golly I want it. The result was the Blue Shield in Michigan went $1 million in the red in 1 year's time. And they abolished that system, and as you know, Blue Shield and Blue Cross have shied away from outpatient charges of that sort ever since. You can't buy a Blue Shield or Blue Cross policy now that pays for a chest x-ray in the office, unless it's associated with an injury, And then you have to have a rib fracture before they'll pay for it. If it's broken, they will, but if it's not, then they won't. Well, this is the kind of thing that's involved in patient education that is not all easy. But the thing I'm getting to really is that if we're going to get away from this business of making medical care more expensive by virtue of the third party paying the bill in full, don't you think that what we're really going to have to do is to go back to the idea of having the patient pay part of it himself out of his own pocket each time he goes to the doctor, each time he goes to the hospital, each time he has an operation, so that he's aware each time that if he stays an extra day in the hospital or an extra has this or has that, that it comes out partly from his own pocket. For instance, yesterday one of my colleagues was called to see a patient who was depressed in the hospital. And he did a routine physical examination on her and saw nothing wrong. The psychiatrist said she was depressed. But the family were convinced that this depression might be the result of some organic illness. So they demanded a brain scan, a skull film, chest x-ray, stomach x-ray, gallbladder x-ray, kidney x-ray, and bowel x-ray, and a bone scan to be sure there isn't a hidden malignancy someplace. Well, for those of you who don't know, that's about $750 worth of x-rays. All because the family wonder if the doctor is correct in saying that this patient is depressed because he's psychiatrically ill or because it might be secondary to some organic illness. Well, I don't know how you're going to avoid some of these things unless we go back to the system of insisting that the patient pay part of the freight. Now, I know we listened way back in the 30s to long harangues by Wilbur Cohen, who's now a professor of education at University of Michigan, but who was an HEW expert at that time, who helped write the Social Security law and the Medicare law and a few other things. He said to have the patient pay part of this, or have him go get welfare money to pay part of this, was demeaning. And so we didn't do it. We were going to pay the bill in full so that everybody could have mainstream medical care paid in full like everybody else, the poor and the rich alike. But what happens? We get into overutilization, and I don't see really any good way to backtrack from that except to make the patient partly responsible for it. And I wonder if you think the same thing. May I ask one more question, and then I'll shut up? This one is to Mr. Ross. Your HSA organization is made up, as you say, of both consumers and providers. But it seems to me there are an awful lot of uninformed consumers in the organization that either need to be informed about something, or else you need to have a whole lot more providers who are informed who can tell them something about what goes on. For instance, at one of the sub-area meetings that I heard about, one of my partners is on the sub-area board of directors, they were talking about priorities. Now, the priority they were discussing was vaccination of children for all vaccinatable diseases, you know, making this the #1 priority for HSA in that area. And they talked for an hour and a half about it. Well, this is great. Who's against, well, I'm certainly for giving kids polio vaccine, you know, and all this kind of thing. But finally, after an hour and a half of this kind of discussion, one of the doctors timorously said, well, do you know that the legislature passed a law that all this is going to be required for all the kids in the state beginning this fall? An hour and a half down the drain, you see, with 22 people sitting there, when maybe if they'd been a little better informed about the situation, there'd been a whole lot of time saved on the part of a lot of volunteers. So I think your objective of getting consumers involved is good, but it should be, I think, consumers who know something about what's going on. Thank you for listening.
Before we go, Mr. Leonard, do you want to respond to that at all?
I certainly do, because I hear this all the time, and I want to say that it's an extremely difficult problem for me, and for our staff, and for our volunteer agency. There do exist in this country and in this state of Iowa many informed consumers of health care. They sit with hospital boards, they sit with nursing home boards, they sit on local boards of public health, etc., etc. and in fact, I'm sure that Dr. Swanson could give a long, long list of informed consumers. Now, there's only one problem with that. Under the law under which we operate, by their acceptance of a position on a board of directors with a hospital, under the rules which our agency operates, they have disqualified themselves as a consumer on the Health Systems Agency board. Now, it's quite difficult for us. I would hope, however, that over a period of time, that if we continue to seek the involvement, if I spend this money judiciously and vigorously to bring consumers into our system, as we have done this past year, that there will be more and more and more informed consumers across this health service area. And of course, I see that then as being my only salvation, because it consumes an inordinately high amount of staff time and budget for educational programs and conferences to help the consumers become informed. So I plead guilty on the count that the information level of many of our consumers is not to the level that Dr. Swanson, the Medical Society, or perhaps even myself and many of our volunteers would like to have. I would also like to go on, though, to reassure Dr. Swanson and all of you that they will not be uninformed consumers for very long, and that they will indeed become more efficient in making objective decisions from the analysis and data that our research and data staff can provide to them.
Thank you.
It seems like it's...
Can I have one more addendum on excuse me, Chuck. I wanted one more addendum, though, that about mine is very brief. Co-payment is finally entering the commercial health insurance field. If you look very closely at your major publications nationally, and I have advanced copies of it, you'll find that Aetna Health Insurance is putting on a very strong campaign to have more and more of their people enroll in co-payment policies, which they contend will reduce their costs to the consumer remarkably.
I was going to say it's kind of pick on John Day, and I don't mean to, but I hope...
John's used to it.
I hope what you said, you really didn't mean that you depend on the wisdom of Congress, because as a collective body, they scare the hell out of me. And I think it points it out when they say hospital trustees who cannot serve on your board because they're considered consumers, yet on a hospital board of trustees, they represent the consumers and are consumers in fact. So their wisdom deviated slightly when they didn't allow one. But I guess the main point is that this is a political ball game that we're in, and the decisions are made in Washington by people that represent us, and we have to communicate with them what we want. And I don't know how you do this. There's many ways to do this, but I think it's extremely important because the decisions they make become the reality of what we have to live with for the next number of years. So I think it's a political ball game with a lot of economics in it, and I don't know if you can separate the two at the Washington level.
All right, audience, it's now your chance.
No, I don't get a rebuttal from Mr. Lindsay. Chuck, I didn't say that I would stand behind all the decisions
Okay.
of Congress.
Okay, questions from the floor? Yes.
I don't think the final rules on that yet have come out from the Department of Health, but I think their plan is to have all the children pretty well immunized. You know, remember the big fight in the legislature was that sponsored by the chiropractors, was that anyone who didn't want to be immunized should be permitted not to. Well, fortunately, that didn't prevail. But if there is a medical reason why you shouldn't be, that's one thing. Or if you have certain religious convictions, that's another thing. Otherwise, they will all be listed, I think, as candidates for immunization, which the medic. Well, I think that's right. Better than nothing, though. But I think the other angle, the one you're worrying about, has been pretty well taken care of by the pediatricians and the family practitioners in Iowa for quite some time.
Please, when you're asking questions, do as the first questioner did. Please stand and speak as loudly as you can so we can all hear. Other questions? You can, and if you wish, please direct these to specific individuals or to the panel as a whole, if that's what you prefer. Yes?
Well, I would like to address this to the panel. I'd like to discuss the problems with the healthcare system. I'd like to know how they, in their opinion, use the legislation now bringing the
Are you thinking of some specific legislation? Okay. This is, on putting certain types of restrictions on, this is really on revenues, is it not?
Well, who wants to start?
I think that's a great question, because yesterday I was sitting out in the audience and I asked the very same question to the four experts that were up here.
Maybe you could tell the audience that, for those who don't know, what this is.
Okay, there is legislation or administration bill, in a thumbnail sketch, an administration bill to put a lid or a cap on hospital revenue. In other words, they're talking about a 9% lid on the dollars of revenue a hospital could have. And the question, of course, comes, what will this do to quality of care, volumes of care, and then it comes down, they're talking a lot of pass-through costs, such as any wage or hour wage increases to non-supervisory people would be passed through. That's not part of the 9%. Certain other types of costs would be passed through or not affected in that. So I think in reality, the 9%, as was stated yesterday, if you pass through these things, and inflation keeps at the pace it is, it could be a pretty livable thing and would make hospitals tighten their belts in some ways, look at different ways of doing things, and probably promote some efficiency, but I don't see a great change in it. And as was mentioned yesterday again from those that knew what they were really talking about, is that this is a tentative program that they're talking about as an interval period until a more definitive type of approach can be to put a lid on the expenditures or the total cost of health care. And billions of dollars were passed around as what is being spent right now. So I don't know if that's answering your question, but it's an attempt to curb the health care cost in a budgetary way and not reflect on service or quality or expansion or new technology.
Would you like to talk to this too?
I think that's a good answer. I maybe talk to one small point of this. I don't really think that we're being pushed around by Washington. I think that we have it in our own hands to make our local systems work. And the biggest problem is one of comprehension. It's not one of billings. It's not the medical profession that's narrow-minded and reluctant. It's not a group of hospitals with vested interests. It's that the problems really are complicated at a time when we've got a lot of other complicated things to deal with as a society. I think I have great optimism that we're moving along pretty well. And I just like to say, let's not muddy the waters by saying those guys are lousing it up. I mean, there's a little element of that, but that's not the real problem.
I'd like to speak in opposition to the cost cap. Standing from where I am, being neither a provider or I guess a consumer either, in this middle ground that I get from both sides. I'd like to speak in opposition to the cost caps for various reasons. First of all, I think that they'll tend to create a floor. I think every hospital administrator in the United States will try to expand his budget the full 9% plus all of the pass-throughs that he can put on to his next year's budget. I think, too, that to control a single percentage figure out of Washington, right, will allow for all of the inefficiencies of all of the states that have inefficiencies to keep going that much further. And what the devil will it do for Iowa, where we might build some efficiencies into the system? There are no incentives along with it other than to create a floor. Now, cost caps to be administered in the way that they are proposed by the current administration are utterly ridiculous, and I should think would be unacceptable to the public, not the provider. I think that they should be unacceptable for 2 or 3 reasons. And I think I've outlined the most important ones too. But finally, they're going to lead away from local autonomy. They're going to lead to a blanket, a commonness of mediocrity, if you will, throughout the healthcare industry all across the United States, and we in Iowa will have to accept that mediocrity.
Why? You can take it into your own hands. You know, I mean, you got it right now. Just decide. You're going to pay that 9% or whatever is along with it. You got it in your own hands to make these decisions. I think we've met the enemy in the IRS.
I guess if we go along with it, we probably are.
I'm not so sure that that's correct, Dr. McGraw. In the first place, it doesn't take into consideration inflation. Suppose your food bill goes up 10%, and you're limited to 9%. Are you going to just put a little less food on each patient's tray? Suppose your other costs go up. Equipment costs go up. Suppose in a hospital who's already budgeted his 9%, he has a major breakdown. A boiler goes kaput, or an X-ray machine has to be replaced or something, and you can't spend any money. It seems to me that it's an unworkable solution. And really won't hold water in the long run, and I doubt seriously that many hospitals, if they can get away with it, are going to hold still for it. Does that answer your question?
Madam Chairman, can I continue? Well, now look, is there, as things now stand, any awareness in Mason City? You have a hospital of
312 beds.
312 beds. Is there any awareness that the cost containment in that hospital is a matter of concern in Ottumwa or whatever's next door, or because it is. This state, the cost of Blue Shield and Blue Cross in this state are a state concern. Your rates are made on a statewide basis. And if you've got an extravagant hospital in Boone, you should pardon the expression, that's of concern to the other people that are bearing the cost. But I think you have it in your own hands to make those decisions. I don't think it's simple. But, as the fellow said, I see a bright future for complexity.
I really don't think the legislation is going to pass. Or if it does, it'll be a major modification of it, because there's a lot of other bills that are in the hopper that may change it. I guess that 9%, if that's a cap they put on, next year it could be 8, 7, 6, 5. And I think we've seen so much of the regulation change the intent of the legislation and twist it around so that we start getting leery of legislation that sets certain factors or controls, not knowing what they'll be 2 or 3 years from now.
Well, I'm gonna say one thing more. I am too, area legislation. I think these problems require much more local initiative and fine tuning. But mind you, the legislation is talking is a matter of desperation. And it reflects the failure to deal with the problem on a local basis. I'm not dead sure that talking about it isn't already having some salubrious effect. I'm not sure that it isn't really making all of us, board members, administrators, physicians, community citizens, if we think about what's involved. We've had a free ride for a generation or more. We've had a cost-plus arrangement. You know, anytime you've got cost-plus reimbursement for 30 years, like we've had, you can't tell me there isn't a heck of a lot of fat in the system.
All right, other questions? Yes.
Unfortunately, we don't address the payment mechanism from there in this particular plan. There is I guess it's been called a preoccupation in some parts of the state. There is detailed information about the supply of beds and the supply of services available. There is not, however, a direct addressment of deficiencies in reimbursement mechanisms, and I'd like to go on to point out that deficiencies in the reimbursement mechanisms exist all the way across our healthcare system, not only in the nursing home industry. Now, you know, it's been said that health planning is nothing more than omnibus tinkering. When you take and try to push down the head of this monster here, another one comes to the surface somewhere else. And I think, you know, that our plan probably is deficient in this area. It's probably an area that needs to be addressed more quickly. I won't make apologies for that. It certainly will be addressed in the second, if not the second, then the third edition of the plan. I think, though, that the general public needs to know that health systems agencies operated under very severe time constraints as they developed these plans, and that this is by no means a comprehensive document. But the law does require us to revise every year. Now, currently, we put the largest amount of money in this state, just to reflect a little bit further on Jerry's question, we put the largest amount of money in this state into intermediate care facilities. And most of the operators know then, since that's where the most of the money is, that is the greatest opportunity to massage profit margins. If you're talking about millions of dollars versus thousands of dollars, where do you want to do business? In the pool that has the millions of dollars available rather than the thousands of dollars available. Currently, we're spending most of our money in this state in intermediate care facilities. That's a middle level of nursing home care. We're spending very little money on residential care, and we're spending even far less money on skilled nursing facilities. The payment rate for the residential care, and Chuck, maybe somebody could backstop me on my recollection of the figures, is in the neighborhood of $12 a day for residential care. For skilled care, they're 30-some dollars a day. But there are no monies in either pot to pay for those levels of care in our Department of Social Service. Medicaid expends its largest amount of monies into intermediate care. Mental retardation gets care through the intermediate care facility arrangement. And that's where the mental health people have the largest amount of their dollars to pay. Now, I've already tried to foreshadow some of the complexities of the system and why I'm trying to give you an honest explanation of why within a period of 18 months, this issue couldn't be dealt with in the plan. But I assure you, because of this complexity and because of the interrelationships that are necessary for change, will be dealt with in future plans.
Dr. Swenson would like to respond to this
Yeah.
too.
Professor Shakeshaft, the nursing home problem in the intermediate care area is complex, but it is made complex by federal regulations. If you, maybe you do know, all the things that these places have to do. They have to have administrators who take courses and take examinations, and they're licensed now. They have to have a certain amount of staff. They have to have a certain amount of room for each bed. They have to have an occupational therapist. They have to have a physical therapist. They have to have a dietitian. They have to have a pharmacy committee. They have to have a medical director, all of which costs money. And the federal government keeps writing more and more regulations that increase the cost, and then they complain about the bill. If the federal government would let the right hand know what the left hand is doing on occasion, it would certainly help. And if they pulled together for once, instead of separately, it would help a great deal more. Now, I don't agree with you that these are local controls. The skilled nursing home finance mechanism, as you know, is mostly federal money. It's more federal money than it is state. And the legislature puts in what they feel like, what they think is going to be. You know, last year they were $8 million short. They had to put in an $8 million emergency appropriation to get them through the end of the year. So it isn't all locally controlled. This is state and federal controlled. We have to meet state and federal standards, and they all cost money. And they get good care, good institutions. But another problem is we simply don't have custodial institutions in the state. In Mason City, there isn't a single custodial institution. To get a patient in for custodial care, we have to send them to another town. Well, this costs money and is inconvenient for families and people and patients. And it's all due, basically, to federal regulations. So I would like to add to this complexity that everyone is talking about, that federal regulations are responsible for a whole lot of it, much too much.
Yes.
Yes, among the possibilities, I'm in skyrocketing costs of healthcare and concerns today, and I wonder if the panel can talk about third-party payment. What about preventive medicine? How much does that actually run? What about hospital and the primary care business, more outpatient care, like discussed about. What about increasing medical technology? Is it bad, or is it more patients and maybe young care, right? I wonder that. Talking about this coordination, services, Mr. Lilly mentioned the national health policy that we need to what you meant by that.
All right, there's several questions in there. Some of these do hinge on topics that were talked about yesterday too, but we'll see what people would like to address these.
I think you probably answered a lot of your question in what is causing the increased cost in let's say, hospital care, because that's what I'm more familiar with, is combination of demands of the public for more quality service, more and more service. Every time they see something on television that Dr. Welby has now done, that becomes the standard for the nation. And Dr. Welby, you never see sending a bill, you never see him in a hurry to do anything, yet he can take care of everything under the sun. Well, that's not reality. But the demand by the patient is he sees what he needs, and he has every right to demand quality care, but the wide breadth of it sometimes costs a lot of money. Research costs money. Then we're faced with just the general inflation. The energy costs are just tremendously having effects on hospital costs and hospital budgets. That and wage and hour laws, and as wages, and as hospitals try to pay compensation to their employees that is equal in compensation to what is being paid in the local community. Our employees deserve just as much compensation as those that are in other lines of endeavor. As we face this kind of a problem, the costs are going up. So there is no one single thing. It's a combination, as I see it, of everything going on, plus the regulation and the laws that require additional people and new standards and higher standards of care all cost money. So it's a combination of that kind of a thing, in my judgment. I think a number of things can be attempted to be done about it, is that to eliminate duplication wherever possible. And we hear a lot about this duplication of not every hospital can be everything to everybody. And this is part of Dr. McGraw's, that there has to be a network and a flow of patients through the system and an allocation of special facilities. And the CAT scanner, I guess, is the ideal one. How many CAT scanners does Iowa need? So I think we have to, as institutions, work together in organizing a system of delivery that eliminates duplication and unnecessary care and treatment. I think we can educate the public to make better use of the facilities. And it was talked about the emergency room at 3 o'clock in the morning, the person coming in with a cold. Well, really, that should be seen in the office or during daytime hours and not have to staff certain things at night to cover this kind of thing. So it's an education of the public to know what it is costing them. I guess I get back to, we hear that, you know, it costs, somebody quoted, and I think it's a misquote, but it costs more for the health care of General Motors than the steel in their car. I don't think that has any comparative anything. So what? It costs more for the health care than the amount of aluminum in a Maytag washer. That's not a relative thing. The priority of what we're going to spend on health care is what's really up to the American public. And 8.3% of the gross national product is now spent on health care. I don't know, maybe it ought to be 10%. But how do we control it? I can't answer you, except that we as individuals must try to control our own costs and our own inputs and what we do. And I want to differ a little bit with you. You said that a cap would automatically make all hospital administrators come up to the level. I think we got to recognize that we have a board of trustees who we have to be accountable to in the public. And it is administration and these trustees that have to look at the overall cost and try to hold them down, which is extremely difficult. Now, I've gone a long ways around telling you I really don't know the answer to your question, but I know we have to look at it in different ways and different controls.
Well, in a way, I think you asked a very profound question. You know, when people say that, they mean they don't know. I do think that or that we may well have sort of let the wind out of the bag, as Ulysses did, you know. I mean, when we kind of moved in all these multiple ways to solve our problems, we set a lot of things in motion. And at the same time we did that, we were circumventing, for good and benign reasons, we were circumventing some of the means of rational control that were always built into that. I agree with Dr. Swanson. I think we've got to get some cost awareness and rationing back into the system. I don't know whether that'll do it. That's you know, if we're going to go about this carefully, we'd shop that out and see if it really did. And before we move very fast, we better kind of tinker with the system a little bit and see how it works. But it makes good sense to me, having been in this game for a long time, that doctors and patients and families and everybody will think a little differently about this if there's a very immediate awareness of cost. I don't think we have a very simple situation. Just think about the business of dialysis and chronic renal disease. Now, those physicians at my age remember when chronic renal disease was something you kind of shrugged your shoulders about. People were going to die. Now we don't do that. You spend $25,000 a year to keep these people alive. The quality of life is not all that sharp. And this whole question of who shall live and who shall die is endless. And not really very easy solutions. And I think that these things get right to the heart of the way we live and the inequities in our society. Because we're talking here about, there's no question. If I'm John Rockefeller and John Kennedy or whatnot, I'm going to have multi-million-dollar share. If I'm somebody who is less advantaged economically in our society, am I going to have the same share? You have.
If you have Blue Cross or Medicaid, you do. That's the way
If
the
you can still
system,
afford it.
that's the way the system works in Iowa. But I think she deserves an answer on the business of increasing technology and the cost of it. I'm sure this plays a tremendous part in it. For instance, the whole subject of intensive care started, with coronary care units. This goes back only to 1962. We've had one, the first one was developed in Kansas City, Missouri in 1962. We had one in Mason City since '67. And about 2 years after that, we started a general intensive care area. It now has 6 beds in it. We have 9 beds in the coronary care unit, and frequently all of them are full. This is a tremendous expense that wasn't there before, because we can do all kinds of things that we weren't able to do before. In intensive care alone, you've all heard about respirators, and the New Jersey case of the girl who, it appears now, was on a respirator for a year when they could have turned it off before. Nothing happened because she's still alive, she's still breathing. Well, how do you know on things of this sort? But the increased technology, all of which costs money, will do an awful lot of things. We now measure blood gases in the patient who's in intensive care who has some kind of respiratory difficulty. We may have to do it almost every hour if it's a critical case. We may have to measure blood electrolytes. We check sodium and potassium and nitrogen and so on, and sugar. We're using pulmonary function tests at the same time. We have other chemistry, blood counts and all this sort of thing. And it does add up to a tremendous amount of expense. Now, this is all progress because we're saving lives now that we didn't save before. We're spending a lot of money doing it, and I don't think the doctors really want to be in the position of deciding which life they're going to save. We go into the picture now of trying to save all the lives that we can within reason. If we get to the point, as was mentioned here a little bit ago, of rationing medical care, then this is going to have to be something that society gets involved in, not just doctors alone, because very few doctors really want to play God on something of that sort. We'll keep people going within reason as long as we can. I don't see any sense in simply prolonging a comatose life just for the sake of prolonging it. I don't agree with that at all. But I've seen people unconscious on respirators from drug overdosage, for instance, as long as 5 days and come out of it. Now, years ago, there was no way they would have lived through that. But this takes money. This is all kinds of expense. And this is one of the things that's increased the cost of medical care, and I don't think at this point we're ready to give it up. I think we got to figure out some way to pay for it.
Is it all progress, though, as you said? Doctors are in a position of being able to turn on a faucet from which emerges a golden stream. And they can walk off and leave that faucet running, whether it's a respirator or it's renal dialysis or whatnot. And I think you may disagree with me about this business of action, but I think we have a trust here, a public trust to utilize these resources very, very carefully. Now, we are asked to make judgments about one of those golden streams, which is days in the hospital. We make those judgments in terms of hospital utilization, peer review, and so forth. That's rational. And we're expected to make that because it's in our professional sphere of expertise. Now, we may not want to think of ourselves as God, but when we send somebody home, on the basis of some judgment at that time, We're making a decision as to whether, it's quite possible to send somebody home post-operatively and have them suicide, for example, or have them, when they wouldn't have it if we maintained it. I don't think we can be so curious about it and say that we aren't, involved in life and death decisions. I think they have to be made, and are being made in the public domain, and should be. But, we're the public agent.
I think one other difficulty with controlling costs, and I'd like to make a comment here, and that is that medical service delivery is just about the most elastic thing that we've ever experienced in our society. Stop and think about it, Go back to Ephraim McDowell the first time the body was cut open, We go back and now then we go and we pass the body through an x-ray machine and the computer tells us what the hell's wrong with it. Medical services delivery, maybe we're talking about healthcare, is just so elastic. And the opportunity to make it even so much more elastic in the future is so broad. Before I tell you how much new technology we'll have to absorb into the healthcare industry in the next 10 years, let me point out that if 1/2 of 1% of that new technology was absorbed by all Iowa hospitals over the next 10 years, our hospital care bills would go up $5 million worth. Because there's $50 billion worth of technology not on the drawing boards, not in somebody's mind, but nearing completion of production, just like CAT scanners. $50 billion worth of new technology that will have to be absorbed in the next 10 years, or the guys who invented it are going to lose their dollars that they have in their investment. Who should control how fast we absorb it in Iowa? You should. What vehicle do you have for controlling how fast we absorb it in Iowa? I go back to my opening remarks. The Health Systems Agency. Support us.
Yes, sir. Who wants to try advertising?
Well, I believe at the present time of the health dollar spent not on over-the-counter medications and TV advertised things, that the physicians get around 17%. Is that correct, I think, of the total health dollar? So if you took all the money away from all the doctors and had them all work for nothing, you'd save only 17%. So I really don't see how advertising back and forth is really going to save anything very much. Our worry on advertising, and it's not prohibited by our medical society or by the AME. You can advertise if you want to, and we do. If you look in the phone book, we have listings for our various specialties, our offices. We have announcement cards if we move, or if we add a new partner, or if we have a new service or something of this sort. We don't advertise fees necessarily, although the Iowa Medical Society has always encouraged doctors to discuss fees with patients if they want to ask any time. And if you may remember, during the Nixon administration, when there was price control, we had to post fees in the office. It had to be written and plugged on a wall someplace. So, and that didn't make any particular difference in the fee schedule arrangement. The thing that we worry about from advertising